I want to talk a little more about the structure of data in a database. So we've talked about tables and fields. Table is where you keep all your data. Fields are the individual items or pieces of information you want to keep about each thing in that table. So let's look a little more about that, and then we'll talk about how the data is actually held in those tables and how that structurally looks a little different. So here's a basic example of a table and some fields. So we got a patient table, maybe it's a dental office, and we're keeping track of some things about each patient. So we have fields for patient number, name, address, city, state. So we have fields for each of those things. Once we get beyond designing the table that way, that's sort of the table design, deciding what we want to keep track of. The next step is to start putting data in the table and understanding just kind of how that's represented and how it looks. So when we do that, we start entering things into a table. They're called records. So if we entered 3 or 4 patients into that patient table, we would have 3 or 4 records in that table. So it's still laid out. You have your tables and your fields, and then the actual data, where the data is kept, are in the records. So let's see how that looks in the database. So this table has about 77 records in it, or entries in it. Right, so it's laid out, table and field, but when we look at the data, we can see those fields, and then we can see each record in the actual data values that are in those things. So the first record has a name, an address, etc. So that's how the data is stored, or how it looks in the actual table once we start getting in there and entering records and using it. I might talk a little more about that, but I'll talk a little bit more about terminology, since we're moving beyond just tables and fields and talking about the actual data that are in those tables. Sometimes you'll hear records called rows. Again, those are essentially the exact same thing. So you could say, okay, there's several rows in this table, or we want to remove this row, or we want to update this row with a new phone number. Those two terms mean the exact same thing. So you could call them records. This has 77 records in it. Or you could call them rows in the table. So you could say, row number 15 has Lisa in it, or what have you. So those are just more terms to be aware of once you start working with the data that's in the table and what it's referred to as. Beyond that, just understanding how it's graphically laid out. The table structure is kind of what the database designer does. Once we get beyond that, we start seeing the sort of the data entry, or the actual data that gets filled in. And that's when we start talking about kind of a different way of looking at the data in this, looking at the rows or the records in it. So again, when you're looking at a row, you still have individual fields where that data is stored. So all these states are stored in a specific field, and you might have many records laid out in that sort of grid layout.